Hey everyone, I'm going to start this video a little bit different. I'm going to start by actually talking about some study tips and test taking tips for our class. So we've had 2 exams now, and if you haven't performed as well as you would have liked on these 2 exams, then hopefully these tips will help you move forward. And of course, you can always reach out to me and ask me for anything else or tell me how you prepared, and maybe we can address that. But I think most of these would address most of the concerns people would have about studying. So my first tip for you is to try to not procrastinate. And I know this is easier said than done, especially since we're all at home. But if you are procrastinating and if you are starting to watch all the lectures and discussions, like 5 days before the exam or something like that, it's going to be really hard to make sure you know everything for the exam. Now, if you start studying as soon as possible, which is the next lecture after the exam, right, when we start class again, then you are able to keep up with the material in a way where you are confused. Like if you are confused about anything, then you have time to deal with that confusion. With procrastination, you're not giving yourself enough time to work through the confusion that is being made by the fact that our material is difficult. So try not to procrastinate, because by procrastinating, you're not giving yourself enough time to work through your confusion. So then you go into the exam kind of iffy on some topics, and those are the questions you get wrong, right? Like the questions that you were like, oh, I knew I needed to know this, but I just didn't quite study because I didn't have time. So make sure you are watching them all when they are assigned, like the week of. So my second tip is to rewatch all the lectures and discussions. So after your first time through, watch them all again. And this kind of goes into procrastination again. If you are procrastinating, you just simply don't have the time to rewatch all the lectures and discussions. Because, it will take some time, even though you can always watch it at like a faster speed. But the reason why I recommend rewatching lectures and discussions is because our exams that we're writing are based off the lectures and discussions. And of course, the lectures and discussions are coming from the textbook. So our lectures are basically summarizing what we want you to focus on in the textbook. So if you aren't reading the textbook, you really need to be rewatching all the lectures and discussions. And the other thing with keeping up with the lectures and discussions is if there's something that is confusing about what we say in our videos, it's on you to come to us and ask to clarify what the confusion is, or to reach out to us and say, there's something about this topic that I'm not quite understanding, or is my understanding correct? Like, what am I missing? Why is this still confusing to me? And we will clarify. Or if it's like, oh, there's kind of like contradictory things in your lecture, I was just wondering if you could clear up like what you meant, kind of thing. And we can totally do that for you. But it's up to you to reach out to us either over email or during office hours to clear up any confusion you have. And there's a lot of benefits and cons to having the fully online class. One of the benefit is that we're able to still do this in the first place, right? Like we still have class because it's all online. And the fact that all of the lectures are recorded for you is also nice because you can watch them as many times as you want. But one of the cons about the online class is kind of related to the exams, is that you're no longer being live proctored in a classroom like you usually would be. So like usually you would be able to like raise your hand and ask me, I'm confused about what this is asking us, could you clarify? And now that it's all online, we unfortunately don't have that ability to do that during the exam. So it's really important that you are studying well enough so that you're not as confused during the exam. Ideally, you wouldn't be confused by anything during the exam because you would just know it all immediately. But that's not always going to be the case, right? Like there's going to be certain questions that are harder than others, and questions that make you think a little bit harder, or application questions that we didn't directly cover, but the stuff we covered should be able to be applied to a new concept. Now the other side of that is also on the instructors, right? Like I understand that we could always make the exams like more clear. So it is something that I'm looking out for when editing the exams, to make sure that things are clear and that false answers are clearly false. So that's also, on both sides of this on my part as well. All right, so the next study tip is to come to office hours. This is like the biggest one in my opinion. When I was taking this class, going to office hours and talking about the material or hearing it talked about in another way was extremely helpful. And so I've compiled a list of all of our office hours for all the TAs, and you'll see that we offer like 11 to 13 hours of office hours. There are some of the UGTA office hours that overlap with mine, so technically it's more like 11 hours a week that we offer. But still, Monday through Friday, there's multiple hours every day that we offer. I personally offer 8 hours a week of office hours. And often the most packed office hour is the day before the exam, which tells me that y'all can make my office hours, especially the day before the exam. Like if it's on a Tuesday and I see a bunch of people on Monday, that means a bunch of people can actually make my Monday office hours. If the test is on Thursday and I see over 100 people in my Wednesday office hours, that means a lot of you can actually make these office hours. So if you know you can regularly make them, then regularly come, because it is the best way to keep up with the material to see what do I know and what do I not know. And likely you would have been confused about something we mentioned in the lecture and something in the discussion. So office hours is the time to clear that up. The day before the exam, yes, you can get those questions answered the day before the exam, but it's probably not going to be as helpful to be learning it the day before the exam rather than learning it right when you're confused about it, like a week before. So what I suggest doing, look through all of these office hours, see if there's at least 1 hour out of these 11 hours a week that we offer that you can consistently make, and schedule it into your week. And just make it something like a mandatory thing for this class. Make it like a synchronous thing for this class. Like every, Monday from 2 to 3, I'm going to go to Kai's office hour, something like that. Yeah, so definitely make sure you are making use of office hours. Now, I also understand that some people can actually not make any office hours because of work, because of school, because of whatever, right? It's not realistic that absolutely everyone can make every single office hour or any at all. So if you're not able to make any office hours, then I would first direct you to rewatching the lectures and discussions. But then I would also direct you to reading the textbook. Because if you're not kind of supplementing the lectures and discussions with something else in another way, then the textbook is where this information is coming from. So hopefully the way that it's worded in the textbook can maybe help versus how we worded it in the lectures and discussions. Now, with reading the textbook, I will point you back to my intro video from the beginning of the semester to see how I recommend going through the textbook, because there's a specific way I recommend reading it. I don't just recommend reading it from start to finish. All right, preparing for the exam and the days leading up. As soon as we post the study guide, which will be about 4 or 5 days before the exam, I suggest you first do the study guide from memory. So put the study guide into a blank Word document and just see how much you remember without looking at your notes. So try to fill out the study guide without looking at your notes. And for some bullet points, you'll probably remember quite a bit. And for other bullet points, you might not remember anything. And that's okay. But what you've done when you've gone through the study guide by yourself is to show yourself, how ready am I for the exam at this moment, right? 4 or 5 days before the exam, how ready am I? And you might not be ready at all. And that's okay, because you've shown yourself, what do I not know? And what do I know? And if you highlight the areas in the material that you don't know, then you know where to start your studying, right? If there's gaps in like the visual system, you know to go and rewatch the lectures, you know to rewatch this discussion, and you know to come to my office hours to get those confusion, or to get those points cleared up, to clear up the confusion. So start by doing the study guide from memory, and then go back and fill in the blanks using your notes and using the resources you have. And my last study tip is to prioritize our material for our exams. A lot of you may be pre-health professional who have maybe studied for the MCAT or studied for some other entrance exam and have had exposure to this material before. And that's great, because that gives you a good foundation going into our class, that these words aren't sounding super new and super confusing right at first. And that's good. However, this is, like I said, an intro physiology class. Like our tests are testing on the basic concepts of physiology. And because this is an intro class and we have to cover the entire human body, we simplify some things throughout the semester. Um, and when we get to this, we usually tell you, like, hey, there's something going on here, something going on here, but just consider it this for the purposes of our class. And there's actually that's actually gonna come up in this discussion when I talk about dark current. It's very complicated. The mechanism's actually very complicated. And maybe if you're like a psych major or something, and have studied sensory physiology before, you may have had to learn actually all the intricate details. And while those details are correct, we are going to test you on a simplified version of it. That's not to say our version is wrong, it's just used for teaching purpose. This is the intro, and we want to give you enough detail so that you learn it, but still keep it surface level so that we can move on, right? Because we have to cover all of the systems in this class. And even then, we don't even cover some of them, like we don't cover digestive or like musculoskeletal, stuff like that. All right, let's move on to test taking tips. So now when it comes to the actual exam, first of all, you need to make sure that your proctorio is working before the exam. So far, I've been making those mock exams before the actual exam. I don't know if I'll keep doing this. I probably will, just because it seems like a nice safety blanket for people before entering the exam. But if you email me the day of the exam saying I can't get in, then there's nothing I can really do, or Dr. Chang can really do. And if I see that you haven't done the mock exam, then it's not really on us, right? Like, it was up to you to make sure that your setup was working correctly for the mock exam. And we can't give out like any sort of code, because the code actually ends up disabling Proctorio. All right, so that's just kind of logistics for getting into the test. But the next thing I want to let you know, and that you've probably noticed already, is that our test is mostly just a true-false test in the format of a multiple choice exam. Because the questions we ask you are usually just things like, choose the correct statement, right? Like, choose the incorrect statement. So the question's not actually a question, which means the actual question is the answer choices A, B, C, and D. And you have to determine which are true and which are false. If you say two of them are true, then you choose E, more than one above. If you said all of them are true, then you choose E, all of the above. If you said none of them were true, then you choose E, none of the above. So this brings me to my next bullet point. Don't default to just E, right? Whatever E is, more than one above, all of the above, or none of the above. If you're confused about a question, don't just put E. The reason is because you want to go with your gut. And your gut will always almost be right, even if you don't fully know why. So let's say you're between two answer choices, like A and C, and you know A is correct, and you are unsure about C. Like, it seems kind of correct, but it also, something is weird with it. Like, it's just giving you like a weird feeling, like you're not totally sure about it. And then you see E is an option, more than one above, and you're like, oh, I can essentially choose both A and C, giving myself a higher percent of chance to get it right, because I can choose both answers. But that's not quite what's happening, because it's a multiple choice test, or it's a multiple choice question. There's only one right answer. So if this was just a true-false exam, or in the format of true-false, and if it was four statements, A, B, C, and D, and you said A was true, and if you're unsure about C, you would probably say false. But now that we've put it in a different format, you're saying C is true by choosing E, and you're putting doubt into your answer. So that's my test taking tip, is to try not to second guess yourself, which again, I know is easier said than done. Try not to change your answers. Try not to choose E when you're not fully confident in it. Only choose more than one above if you are 100% sure which two are correct. And only choose all of the above if you are 100% sure that all of them are correct. Now, the all of the above or none of the above is actually a little bit easier, because you can use it to your benefit. Like, if it says all of the above and you know one of them is false, but are unsure about two more being false, well, if one of them is for sure false, it can't be all of the above. So then you know you can mark that out. So you can actually use those all statements to your advantage. All right, moving on. Don't change your answers once you've chosen an answer. Again, go with your gut. your gut will almost always be right, even if you can't explain why. Even if you don't remember that concept in the moment, your gut is probably still right. And that brings me to my next point. Don't go back to questions after you finish the exam, which I know sounds almost counterintuitive and scary. And I don't mean like finish the exam and then just press submit. But what I do mean is after you finish the exam and you have time to look over it, only look over it to make sure you have chosen the answer you meant to choose. Like if you knew you chose this answer, then make sure you actually chose that answer, right? Make sure you didn't accidentally just like miss the bubble and not choose an answer at all, or make sure you didn't miss a question entirely. But do that instead of going back through and highlighting questions to retry again at the end of the test. Because if you say like, oh, I'm going to come back to number 5 because it was hard, and if you come back to it at the end of the exam, you're coming back to it with the intention of changing your answer and ignoring your initial gut feeling. And when you do that, again, you're most likely going to change it to a wrong answer. So stick with your gut. Don't change answers once you've selected an answer, and make sure you selected the one you meant to select. But don't go back and try to rework questions. If you've answered it, just finish it and move on. All right, my last test taking tip. Do the multiple choice and short answer first. Reason being is you get partial credit here. And if you're most likely to make a mistake during the beginning of the exam because your brain's not warmed up, I'd rather you make that mistake on an area where you get partial credit. Versus the versus just the multiple choice where it's one right answer or no points. Right? If you make a mistake early on because your brain's not really in the zone yet, then you're just going to miss those points entirely. Versus the other area where you will probably still get partial credit. Okay, so those are all of my tips for studying and taking the exam. Now let's 17 minutes in, let's get started to the actual sensory discussion. All right, so I will be doing the discussion worksheet on this, but I won't necessarily be like writing out everything on the sheet. I will talk about the concepts, and then you can use what I talked about to write it out in your own words. But I will be covering everything under these questions in this video. And I'll just do like maybe the first question and then do part 2 of this, since this video has run a little bit long now. So the first part is just to explain the 3 types of sensory receptors, and in the 5 senses, which sense uses which receptor. So I've pulled this slide from your lecture notes to help me describe it. And the simple receptors and the complex receptors, these are part of the somatosensory system. This is your touch sense, and the simple receptors have the free nerve endings in the skin. So to give more context to this, I've just pulled a picture of like the anatomy of the skin, and you can see here the nerve, that there's just these free sensory nerve endings in the skin, and these are these simple receptors. Now these are mostly for identifying pain, things like chemical pain, thermal pain, mechanical pain. So you can have something like sharp cause pain, you can have something like a chemical pain. If you've ever been working in a lab and have spilt something on your skin and then it starts hurting, that's like a chemical pain. Or if you've ever cut like a pepper and some of the juices inside got on your hand and caused you to burn, that's another form of chemical pain because capsaicin is binding to painful receptors. And there's also thermal pain, right? Like if you touch something too hot, it can cause pain. So those are the simple receptors. The complex receptors, it's also part of the somatosensory cortex, the somatosensory system, but it's just more for like light pressure, things that aren't necessarily noxious or painful, but it's still part of the somatosensory. All right, the special sense receptors are your other 4, so olfactory, gustatory, vision, and auditory. So your special senses are your other 4 senses. because they use a special sensory receptor. The olfactory and gustatory use a chemical receptor, right? The chemical being the chemical molecule that you are smelling or the chemical molecule that you are tasting. Vision uses rods and cones. Auditory uses hair cells. And this is what's actually shown in this picture. So this picture, it shows a hair cell. So this is an example of the auditory system. And in lecture, you heard Dr. Chang mention that the special sense receptors involves two cells. And those cells are the sensory receptor itself, which is cell 1, and the neuron, which is cell 2. Whereas the somatosensory only used one cell each time. It only used that nerve, that sensory nerve. But you can see that these special sense receptors are using two sensors, or two receptors. So in the case of the auditory system, it uses these specialized hair cells. And these are mechanically gated ion channels that open when the waves of fluid move through your cochlea and push these hair cells to one side. That is the mechanical stimuli to open these channels and cause a depolarization. Now, when that happens in a special sensory receptor, that is called a receptor potential. Whenever these special sensory receptors get the physical stimulus, they will depolarize. And that is called a receptor potential. So it's not an action potential because an action potential is for a neuron. It's a receptor potential because it's a change in membrane potential, but it's in a sensory receptor. And this is most similar to a graded potential in terms of its physiological function because it can be graded. Like it can increase the strength of the depolarization or increase the amount of neurotransmitter it's releasing based on how much stimulation it got. So receptor potential is graded because it can alter its strength. And then the neuron, this would just be a regular action potential like we learned in Unit 2. All right, so I'm going to stop part 1 here and pick up with the rest of the discussion in part 2.